Welcome to video number 9 and to the philosopher that may be the most familiar to many of us, John Stuart Mill, who gave us, though not in these exact words, the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. So we'll dive into that in just a moment, but a quick review of the previous video, in fact the previous videos. We've been going chronologically through some of the great ethics philosophers and what core idea they might be able to give us to help us address and ideally resolve an ethics dilemma, a dilemma where values are clashing and we need to do our best thinking at what may be a very stressful time. And so it's nice to fall back on, okay, I'm going to put my Aristotle hat on for a moment and think like Aristotle. Okay, there's one perspective. Off comes the Aristotle hat, on comes the Kant hat. Off comes the Kant hat, on comes the Mill hat. You get the picture, the haberdashery or whatever hat stores are called. Our immediately previous video, we talked about Immanuel Kant and that brilliant idea he gives us of the categorical imperative, where we take the action that we think we're going to pursue, either generally or specifically, to address an ethics dilemma, and we ask 3 questions of that. Would the world work if everyone did this? Even if the world would work, if everyone did this, would I want to live in such a world? And the third question is, are we deliberately and maliciously using a human being as a means to an end? And we need the right answers to those for it to become a duty that's worth pursuing. Otherwise, that becomes, at least with our Kant hat on, a dead option, one that we would not pursue. Well, as we move into video number 9 and John Stuart Mill, what are the key points we're going to be looking at? One, we're going to be looking at the connection of the good. Mill actually used the word happiness, a familiar word to us in this class. We're going to look at the connection of the good / happiness to pleasure and pain and how those two concepts get distributed. That's going to be a big idea. The next big idea, and boy does this sound unlike our previous guy, Kant, with Mill, it's going to be the importance of projected consequences. We're going to look at the projected consequences, the possible, the likely consequences of the actions that we're considering to address our ethics dilemma. More big words so we can talk the talk in ethics theory, utilitarianism, which again is the greatest good for the greatest number, and teleology, more on that in just a bit. And then lastly, dangers and difficulties, of applying Mill's philosophy. So let's move forward and dig into what that philosophy is. John Stuart Mill is an English philosopher, British philosopher, whose life essentially spanned the 19th century. He was born in 1806, lived to 1873. We've looked at Mill before. We saw him in our first PowerPoint lecture. He's one of the many philosophers who believes that happiness is the highest goal of human beings. That's what we strive for more than anything else. And he felt that to achieve that, we seek the greatest happiness for the greatest number. In that earlier video, I said that Mill had actually written these words, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. He didn't write those words. Philosophers before him and after him, we kind of take their ideas and fold them into Mill. So I shouldn't have said that he wrote those exact words. He did frequently write about the greatest happiness principle and was essentially writing about the greatest happiness for the greatest number, the greatest good for the greatest number, but he didn't exactly use those words, although that was his idea. Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher from the generation before Mill, actually wrote of the greatest happiness of the greatest number was our best way to happiness and living the ethical life. And then a generation after Mill, an English philosopher named George Moore, said he substituted the word good because he thought that made it easier to understand. The greatest good for the greatest number. So the phrase that we tend to associate with Mill's big idea is the greatest good for the greatest number. Interestingly, I don't think Mill himself ever wrote those words. Bentham, the philosopher who was a generation before Mill, I believe coined the term utilitarianism for this concept of what is an ethical action. It's the one that creates the greatest happiness or the greatest good for the greatest number. That's essentially the bedrock of the utilitarian idea. Where that word comes from, you can hear the word utility in there, meaning usefulness. So, which action has the greatest usefulness to our goal of achieving happiness? Well, the action that has the greatest usefulness, according to Bentham and Mill, is the one that increases pleasure and decreases pain. So an action has ethical usefulness for this idea. It has ethical usefulness to the degree that it increases widespread pleasure and reduces widespread pain. Mill himself, I've already said this, called this the greatest happiness principle. But here it is in his own words. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. And again, this now has become, we're borrowing from G.E. Moore, this has become the greatest good for the greatest number. So we have, I'm looking at the last bullet here, we have a bunch of terms that are kind of dancing together here and all essentially mean the same thing. The good and happiness and the association of pleasure and pain with the achieving of the good and happiness. This I hope this isn't too much of a muddle. This will become clearer, I think, in just a moment. One of my early concerns about Mill was, does he really focus on the greatest number the way that Jeremy Bentham before him and G.E. Moore after him do? He frequently, in his book titled Utilitarianism, Mill frequently writes about the greatest happiness principle. It's hard to get away from that phrase in the book. But he doesn't even use the word number as a singular noun in that book. So I've worried a little bit that maybe we're grafting too many other people's ideas onto Mill. But I want to share this long, sorry about that, quotation with you where he doesn't ever use the phrase, you're tired of hearing me say this, the greatest good for the greatest number, or the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But in this quotation, you can see he's clearly thinking in that direction. So even though Mill never says those words, I'll try to quit saying that, I think we can be comfortable in attributing that concept to him. Wade through this long quotation with me. Though it is only in a very imperfect state of the world's arrangements that anyone can best serve the happiness of others by the absolute sacrifice of his own happiness, yet so long as the world is in that imperfect state, I fully acknowledge that the readiness to make such a sacrifice, meaning personal happiness for the greater good of others, to make such a sacrifice is the highest virtue which can be found in man. It often has to be done voluntarily by the hero or the martyr for the sake of something which he prizes more than his individual happiness. But this something, what is it? Unless the happiness of others. Well, that's kind of taking us around the barn, but Perhaps you'll join me in thinking that is pretty clear evidence that Mill is thinking about the greatest good for the greatest number, even if that involves some personal sacrifice. Before we get to the exact idea that Mill gives us, just as Aristotle gave us the arrow and Kant gave us the categorical imperative, I think just a bit more background will help us here. This philosophy, I'm looking at the first bullet, this philosophy of utilitarianism judges a decision by its consequences. We're obviously having to project, what is the greatest good? What is the outcome of this action for these different groups? And how many people are in those groups? And what will the impact be? Obviously, consequences matter a great deal. And you can see how much at odds that puts Mill with Kant, which is a wonderful thing for us because, again, remember, in critical thinking, we're looking for comprehensive approaches to this. We're looking for different approaches to trying to solve our dilemma. And so we've got Kant and Mill, if time and space allowed, they'd probably get in a fist fight over this. Mill, who lived after Kant, called Kant's ideas grotesque. That was his exact word. So there's a sharp difference here that's quite useful to us. We're going to come at, when we move from Kant to Mill, we come at our ethics dilemma from a very, very different angle. Thank goodness. That's going to be useful for us. So logically, it's also utilitarianism is also called, it's a consequentialist theory. Remember that that Kant was non-consequentialist theory. Here comes another big term in ethics theory, teleological theory. It comes from the Greek word telos, T-E-L-O-S, which means goal or aim. Goal or aim. So we're very interested in the outcome, the projected outcome of what we think our actions will be. And again, you can see what a strong contrast that is to Kant and deontology, and that's nothing but good for us. And in fact, probably the three biggest theories in ethics theory are deontology related to Kant, teleology related to Mill, and the so-called virtue ethics of Aristotle. Another contrast we see between Mill and Kant is this teleological theory of utilitarianism obviously values the end over the means. We are interested in outcomes. We are interested in consequences. And so, again, you know that Kant would disagree with this. But in teleology, we're going to value the end over the means. W.D. Ross, who we looked at when we were trying to bring some flexibility to Kant's idea of the categorical imperative and the perfect duty, W.D. Ross is much more in the camp of Kant than Mill. Ross thinks it's kind of ridiculous that we instinctively do these calculations of, what is the greatest good for the greatest number? He's not saying we don't do it, but he's saying it's not basic human nature to operate that way. And here's a quote from Ross. Please think for yourselves on this. Ross is kind of our most interesting bench player in the big idea people we're going to bring into the course. But Ross says, when a plain man, boy, there's that man again. I'm sorry about the sexist language and all of the men we are looking at. When a plain man fulfills a promise because he thinks he ought to do so, it seems clear that he does so with no thought of its total consequences, still less with any opinion that these are likely to be the best possible. He goes on to say, almost as Kant would say, he fulfills a promise because he just instinctively believes that that's his duty because he made the promise. As we apply Mill's idea of the greatest good for the greatest number to solving an ethics dilemma, or maybe not solving it, but trying to find the least painful way forward, we need to be constantly mindful of two dangers within this philosophy. One is the wide range of pleasures. You can tell in Utilitarianism, the book about ethics that Mill wrote, that he's using the utilitarian term pleasure, but he's a little bit nervous about using that word because of all the things that pleasure can mean and all the different levels and different kinds of pleasure. Here's a hint. He's talking about more than sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or a six-pack of beer and a Little Caesars pizza or something like that. But he's aware that people are going to interpret it that way. So he's asking us to be on guard against that. And then a second danger is one that I think because he didn't really use the word number, he's really not as cognizant of this one. But people who apply Mill's theory, I think, are very mindful of this. And it's the overemphasis on number. When you are leading your team through an ethics dilemma and you all put on your Mill hats and you're going to talk about, okay, well, which action does seem to create the greatest good for the greatest number of all our proposed actions? It's a lot easier to calculate number than it is good. And that's something you're going to have to be mindful of. More on both of these here in just a moment. Regarding that first danger, the quality of different pleasures, maybe better said, the ambiguity and the breadth of the term pleasure, Mill almost obsesses on this. He makes it very clear. He's talking about the higher pleasures, which are the intellectual and moral pleasures. And he even defends that those are the greatest pleasures. So let's wade through where he discusses this. He says some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. Pleasures derived from the higher faculties are preferable in kind to those of the animal nature. And then this last bullet where he mentions the Epicurean philosophy, the happiness-seeking, pleasure-seeking Epicurean theory. He says there is no known Epicurean theory of life which does not assign to the pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments a much higher value as pleasures than to those of mere sensation. This will be useful when you're talking about increasing pleasure and pain. And I mean, let's hope you have a flippant person in your group, someone with a sense of humor. But they may lead you in the direction of, oh, okay, well, let's talk about a good Netflix movie, a six-pack of beer, and a Little Caesars pizza. And you're going to have to say, well, that don't let me talk you out of those being the highest pleasures. But right now we have our Mill hat on, and he says those are not the highest pleasures. The highest pleasures are those involving the intellect, the feelings, the imagination, and the moral sentiments. So Mill gives you ammunition to push back on that for a while. Something else that can be useful when you're the team leader and you are trying to lead the group through an ethics dilemma, something that can be useful is Mill readily acknowledging that those higher pleasures are harder to achieve than the lower pleasures. But he memorably says they're worth the effort. Even if we fall short of achieving those higher pleasures, it's better to aim at those and fall short than to settle for those lower animal-like pleasures. And he memorably says, it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. He goes on to say, I'm paraphrasing here, but he gets close to these exact words. It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than an idiot satisfied. So he thinks as we're trying to live our best life, to achieve happiness, to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number, we're going to damage ourselves if we aim low in how we're defining pleasures. This gets awfully subjective. So how do we rank pleasures? And he's even got some advice on this. He says, of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. So you may just have to assemble your team again and say, okay, in your experience, which of these is the higher, more enduring, more long-term satisfying pleasure? That's what he's asking you to do there. Regarding the second danger, the overemphasis on number, Mill really doesn't give us, that I can discover, any strong warnings on this. I think it's just among those of us that have taught ethics for a long time and actually use things like the Ginn model and the Potter box in our own lives have realized the temptation to go with the easier way on this. Again, it's pretty easy to count heads, or at least it's relatively easier to quantify the number of people involved than it is the good. Which good is better? How do you quantify good? Identifying the higher pleasures can help there, but it's not an easy calculation. And Mill doesn't give us a lot of advice, but he does say it would be absurd that the estimation of pleasures should be supposed to depend on quantity alone, meaning how much of a particular pleasure. I'm probably extrapolating too much from this, but we do see Mill warning about a reliance on quantity, which I'm going to extend to counting heads. When you apply Mill in an ethics dilemma, you're going to have to be careful that your team doesn't steer toward some huge group that gets some minor good. But it's a huge group, and there's a much smaller group that's just getting decimated by your decision. But it's a small group, and it's going to be easier to overlook. The example I sometimes use, and it's purposely dumb to be memorable and dramatic, is it wouldn't be fair, it wouldn't be Mill, it wouldn't be utilitarianism, it wouldn't be the greatest good for the greatest number for everyone in our class to get lollipops, but I get dragged out in the hall and have my legs broken. That's the price of you all getting lollipops. Well, you're definitely the greatest number. You outnumber me, a dozen to one. But the good that you're getting, everybody gets a lollipop, probably is not sufficient compensation for me grumbling out there in the hallway, probably more than grumbling with two broken legs. So it's be mindful, be watchful for that, because as I say, it's so much easier to count heads than it is to focus on the nature of the good and the pleasure and the pain. Are we ever going to apply Mill? Yes, we are. Yes, we are. Look at that first bullet, applying Mill. In an ethics dilemma, let's say our proposed solution is action A. That looks like a good one to us. And so we want to run it. We want to put our Mill hats on and consider that. We're going to have to identify the various stakeholders, the people who are affected by our decision. And so if you look at the left column in our chart here, we've got the different stakeholder groups and how many people are in each group, because we're looking for the greatest good for the greatest number. I know I just warned about overemphasizing the number, but we do have to consider that. So there's number on the left, and then good, pleasure, pain over on the right. And so we take stakeholder group number one. It's one person. Well, they're going to lose by this, but it's just a small pain. Stakeholder group number 2 is 4 people, a much larger group. They're going to win, and it's a medium amount of happiness, a medium pleasure. Stakeholder group number 3 is 2 people. They lose, but it's a big loss. It's a big unhappiness. See how we're trying to quantify the good as well as quantify the number, the greatest good for the greatest number. Stakeholder number 4 is 1 person. They win. It's a small happiness. This is what we need to do, something like this, to apply Mill. Interestingly, one of the philosophers we're going to look at soon is John Rawls, and he is going to ask us to identify all the stakeholders in a particular ethics dilemma as well. So we'll be getting to use this same list. With our handy dandy Mill chart now, we try to add all this up and ask ourselves, does winner happiness, meaning pleasure, absence of pain, outweigh loser unhappiness, the amount of pain being inflicted? And so we have 5 people winning, and it's medium and small happiness, so not a great amount of pleasure, clearly not much pain. We have 3 people losing, so a smaller group, but it's a small and a big unhappiness, and it's a big unhappiness to 2 people. So you can see the difficulty with Mill. We're kind of in the middle. I would want to explore what's the nature of that big unhappiness. And if it's a whopper, I'm not sure. I know we're talking abstracts here. I'm not sure the medium and small happinesses that are moving toward that larger group of people that are winning, I'm not sure that justifies the big unhappiness. But it's hard to talk about this in the abstract. We would need to do more. Once we've made our decision, can we tweak that decision to improve these ratios? Can we do anything? Remember what the good is. Remember what happiness is. It's increasing pleasure and decreasing pain. So even when we think we know what we're going to do, can we look at it again and see if those qualities can be increased and decreased in the right direction? Something that's going to help us apply Mill is the Genn model. And I know we haven't fully fleshed that out yet. I just keep alluding to it. But it's a systematic way of addressing an ethics dilemma that's going to ask us to involve Aristotle, Kant, Mill, Rawls, some of the other philosophers we're going to look at. And it suits Mill very well because the first question of the Genn model is, should I, and then fill in the blank of, should I fire someone who doesn't deserve to be fired? Should I tell a lie to get out of this dilemma? Should I, it gives you a proposed action, either specific or general, and that can get you started with Mill. If I did fire someone who didn't deserve to be fired, who are all the stakeholders here? Would they win or would they lose? What would be the pleasure and pain that accrues to all those people? So I'll try not to get us bogged down in this, but it's another strength of the Genn model with, Mill, oh gosh, where do we start? We can use that first question of the Genn model and use that as a basis for applying Mill. And finally, something else we can do with Mill that's related to the Genn model is the Genn model and the Potter box and other good ethical decision-making models are usually going to give us several possible courses of action based on our good critical thinking. And if we had the time and inclination, I rarely do this, to be honest, in my own life and in class, but if we had the time and the inclination, we could take every proposed action and run it through that Mill chart of the stakeholders on the left and the pleasure-pain calculation on the right. And that's what we're trying to do with this grid right here. Let's say we had, actions A through J. and we run a mill calculation on every one of them. And you can see what our two axes here. One is the greatest good, ranging from high to low, and the other is the greatest number, ranging from high to low. And so clearly that upper right quadrant would be high number and high good. So actions C, A, and E in the green look like the greatest good for the greatest number. Um, um, the ones in yellow are scoring well on one axis, but not on the other. So actions D and I are scoring great goods, but not great numbers. But it's just a cautionary yellow. We're still going to look at those probably. Actions J and H, same thing, great number, but not necessarily a great good. The ones we probably can discount are the ones in the lower left because they're low good and they're low number, and we can dispense with those. So it just depends on how far you want to push mill. I'll be honest, I find mill the hardest of our philosophers to apply because of the ambiguity of calculating the greatest good and then balancing that with the greatest number. But mill almost always leads to good discussions when you and your team are assembled and are addressing an ethics dilemma. And that's a good note to end on. Mill brings a lot to the party.